Welcome to part 2 of our discussion of key action operators in the RxJava Observable class. These action operators don't modify an observable, but instead just use it for side effects. And we'll be talking here about the doFinally and doOnComplete operators. We'll start with the doFinally operator. This operator calls the specified action after the current observable terminates. In particular, the action parameter that's passed here is called when the observable signals on error or uncompleted, or is disposed of by the downstream. Action is a functional interface. It's very similar to the runnable functional interface. However, it allows throwing of a checked exception. So in other words, you can think of the action parameter as essentially being a callback that only has a side effect. It returns a new observable instance. However, this instance cannot have its change in its type, can't have a change in its value in any of the elements that it processes. The doFinally operator also doesn't operate by default on any particular scheduler. It depends on the context in which the operator is called to decide what threading context it will run in. For example, this snippet of code comes from a case study we'll examine in more detail at the end of this lesson. And what it's going to do is it's going to use the observable create factor method operator to emit a bunch of large random big integers, which it will then process in a background thread returned by the new thread factor method. And it will then check to see whether those big integers are prime or not. And then finally, by using the doFinally operator, it will go ahead and print out some results to aid with debugging. As you can see here, what's passed as a lambda expression to doFinally is a method that will only have a side effect. There will be no changes whatsoever to what's happening in that chain of values that are going through the observable. Project Reactor has a flux doFinally operator that works essentially the same way. This particular example is slightly different, however, because of the difference in semantics between RxJava and Project Reactor with respect to the new thread and new parallel operators. New parallel, as you can see here, returns a scheduler that has to be cleaned up explicitly by disposing of it. So in this case, we're going to use doFinally to actually have a side effect of disposing of that scheduler. So you can think of this as basically using it as a destructor. Let's now turn our attention to the doOnComplete operator. This operator returns an observable that invokes an action when the current observable calls onComplete. The action, of course, as we talked about before, is a functional interface very similar to runnable, but it allows throwing a checked exception. In other words, this action parameter is a callback as it was before. As with doFinally, doOnComplete returns a new observable instance, but it can't change the type and it can't change the value of any elements that it processes. doOnComplete also does not operate by default on a particular scheduler. And moreover, it only happens to get called when the onComplete method is called. It doesn't get called under error conditions. So as you can see here, we have a similar example as we did before, where we're going to be emitting big random integers using emit interval. And that's going to end up running in a background thread because remember, interval runs in a background thread by default. And then we're going to check to see if those numbers are prime. And assuming everything goes well, then doOnComplete will get called and we'll be able to have a side effect of displaying the results. So again, keep in mind that doOnComplete only works when things complete successfully, whereas doFinally is always called. Project Reactor has a flux doOnComplete operator that works the same way as it does with RxJava's observable. So that's the end of our second part of the discussion of key action operators in RxJava's observable class.